My name's Ross Brewer. I'm with the Cyber Intelligence community, and I'd like to welcome you and thank you for your time, and really want to thank everybody that's subscribed and liked and shared and clicked on the bell so they're getting notifications of these videos. Today we're going to carry on with our Chief Information Security Officer series, and I'm joined by James Blake, who's a customer CISO advisory within ServiceNow. I've probably sort of messed up his title a little bit, but with that being said, I'm going to ask James to introduce himself in a moment. I'd really like to thank James for his time.
Hello, Ross. And shame this isn't face to face, but this is the new reality that we're living in. And in fact, dealing with customers all over the globe, it's actually relieving that I don't have to travel to them at the moment, but I'm stuck at my desk 24/7 at the moment on conference calls. So thanks for giving me another one at 7 o'clock in the evening. So, I originally started on development side of things, writing software. I was a developer originally, migrated into an IT operations role, where I was the IT director for a pharmaceutical services company. And then I went for a series of roles which were really focused around resiliency. So I worked in things like business continuity planning, service guard clusters under HP, highly resilient things. But I gradually moved more and more into cybersecurity. So yeah, swapped around for a few years in professional services, implementing very large sort of implementations for all sorts of infrastructure companies, some defense and intelligence organizations as well, and eventually landed into a role with Mimecast as their CISO. So I joined as, I think, the first dozen of a couple of employees there, and stayed with the business pretty much from when we had this small idea that we were building as a POC and our original sort of minimum viable product, up until when I left and we were 1,300 employees. We'd listed on the NASDAQ. We obviously grown 1,400% year on year. Then went to build SOCs for HP Enterprise, as you mentioned, for quite a few large companies, some of the largest retailers, technology, software companies in the world. Saw a lot of the same problems in SOCs, and I still see all the same problems now, and they were the same problems we're having in 2000 that SIMs were supposed to solve. And went from there to JPMorgan, ran cybersecurity, what they call integration there. So that is getting the threat intel, the cybersecurity operations center, and incident response within the business units, defining that target operating model and how they work together, and how you bring together application security, cyber risk management, vulnerability management, and all of these different aspects of operational security under one kind of operating model with supporting platforms and processes. Then I find myself at ServiceNow now. So, and my role here is largely to work with our strategic customers. And as I mentioned earlier, the skills you need for transforming businesses tend to be largely different from the ones from BAU activities. So the idea is we help customers rebuild the aircraft while it's still in the air. So an awful lot of that is about managing culture and politics in the business. Very little of it is about technology and cyber risk, actually, believe it or not. And also founded, while I was doing this, founded B-Size London, obviously large conference, 1,300, along with 6 or 7 other people. That conference has run every year since 2009 now. So I think it's our 11th year this year.
I think the number of SOCs, security operations centers, that you were instrumental with your team building for some of the largest logos on the planet topped out at about 91. Intelligence, first and foremost, that people can use, and also where to gain intelligence as it relates to cybersecurity, how to apply it. The second area that we tend to focus on is best practice. And then the last area is sort of experience, trying to share real world experiences to stop people reinventing the wheel, falling into the same traps, having the same breaches, because these topics are not talked about openly like we're trying to do here, which is quite difficult because we have to balance confidentiality and so. So with that being said, James, I know that you've done a lot of analysis work with operations. I think at least a couple of hundred operations organizational assessments that you have done. So I think from sort of a intelligence standpoint, if we could start there in terms of what you've learned and advice that has come from that that you could share with the community, I think that would be a fantastic place to start.
Done about 220 different assessments and all sorts of vertical markets, all sorts of geographies. And what we did is we looked at around 260 different aspects of business alignment, governance, people, process, and technology, and gave them a CMMI score. So 0 meant largely they're not doing something. 1 meant they're doing something ad hoc. Every person does it a different way. Every time it's done a different way. 2 is documented, and they're doing what's documented. 3, they're collecting some form of metrics around it. And then 4, those metrics are expressed in a quantitative form, like usually in monetary form. So in other words, 3, they're using some kind of metrics for continual improvement, but 4, they're demonstrating value of everything to the business that is scored at 4. So if you've got your people processes scored at 4, you're showing the value of your processes that people are doing and the value of each individual in your organization. Now, no surprise, the average score across all vertical markets is way under 2, right? And the biggest takeaway is that there is no correlation or linear correlation between spend and operational capability. So in other words, some of the companies that are spending the most, that have the biggest teams, even with organizations in the same vertical market, with the same regulatory and compliance obligations, with the same kind of infrastructure, some of them with teams of 100 are doing much worse than people with teams with 28. Right? It's all about approach. And one of the problems we have, and it will come back to the process and technical debt cul-de-sac that you mentioned earlier, the mistakes we can make, is the annual budget buy silver bullet solutions, which are actually products. And this hamster wheel of continually every year buying more and more products and never truly operationalizing them, never truly integrating them, and never truly getting the value out of them. I think at the RSA conference 2 years ago, there was a presentation, I think it was by Deloitte, and they said the average enterprise has 130 different security products in it. And if you look at even small and medium enterprises, they're 30 to 50. And if you look at the MITRE ATT&CK framework, for instance, which I love as a reference for bringing these different silos, which will be the thing I talk about next, of cyber threat intelligence, of cyber risk management, and of operational security together, there's 4 event sources which will cover 86% of the 300 odd MITRE ATT&CK techniques. And then when I go and look at these organizations and what sources were going into their SIMs and into their SOCs, only 3% of those 220 organizations monitored those 4 things. Why? Because a lot of those 4 things kind of overlap with IT, and security is too busy sat in the basement doing its own thing and banging its fist on the table and making demands of other people. So I think one of the other takeaways then is obviously money doesn't get you out of a problem. And I mentioned it earlier, the biggest constraint is not normally, once you get over a certain level, not normally headcount or budget. The constraint is the ability to change the culture in an organization, and also the ability to navigate politics and understand what's in it for them for every improvement and control you want to deploy within an organization. You have to kind of think of every deliverable you have in every project and the benefit it has to every stakeholder, and build a communications plan to articulate the value of everything you do. You know, CISOs that are technical often fail, and they were the ones that we saw with the lowest levels of maturity and the highest operational budget and capital budget, but the lowest levels of operational capability, and the ones that managed up and out and into the business and were about stakeholder management and managing a team of technical, competent people, but keeping them directed at a goal of managing cyber risk and demonstrating that value to the business. They're the ones that really had impact. So I think if I could take my 6-7 years, you know, experience of assessing all those organizations, those would be my two biggest takeaways. The hamster wheel of buying more products but never operationalizing them, and the fact that the CISO role is really about enabling the business and managing the relationships with the business rather than managing technology. So they're kind of my two biggest lessons learned.
It's really interesting you should say that, James. We're spending about $100 billion a year on cybersecurity, and we're still seeing widespread problems. And furthermore, if you look at the data breach and investigation reports, in 82% of the cases, the control was available that could have stopped the breach. However, it wasn't effective. So one of several things are happening. Either the control is not configured correctly on the platform, or the security technology is not configured correctly, or the security technology doesn't do what it says on the side of the tin, or the security pipeline, as we call it, the sort of end-to-end people, process, technology, SIM, security operations center, managed security service providers, that whole complete end-to-end pipeline, there's some process failure or some technology communications failure. I think you mentioned about operationalizing it and the integration. So the operationalizing falls down, the integration falls down, or maybe the testing is falling down. There's not enough testing of these controls and things. Now, it's really interesting, James, you said there's 4 log sources that can cover a large portion of the framework. Would you just be able to sort of expand upon those 4? Because I think that's really key information that'll help organizations think about this.
Those 4 largely fall down into 3 categories, because one is a subdivision of one category, 2 of them are. And they are file integrity monitoring. The second one is process monitoring, and largely the last 2 fall into script monitoring, the execution of scripts. So with those 4, you are able to capture 86% of the MITRE attack techniques that are out there. And because file integrity monitoring usually involves having to deal with the IT department and having to deploy on the endpoint a technology that may or may not be owned by the security department, there is a lot of resistance because there's still a huge silo between IT and security within organizations that I see now in my current role, and I've seen in every role I've had, really. So, and those are not easy technologies to deploy, but when you consider the cost of, let's say that we take those 4, and that leaves us 126 solutions that we could be saving money on, right, and not deploying. We should focus on the ones that are effective and provide solutions. And the other thing is we get stuck on this hamster wheel of a year. We have to show value of this product within a year because we bought it out of our budget this year. We have to deploy it this year. It has to be successful this year. And then next year, we've got our eye on the next unicorn and silver bullet. What we really have to do is develop a more pragmatic approach where continual improvement is a part of what we do. So we build a minimum viable product to mitigate risk with the product, but then we build in the right processes to measure and continually improve both the configuration of that control and also the processes around it. So this is a large amount of what I spend my time on now. Anton Zvokin, one of my former colleagues, was at Gartner for years, one of the kind of first people to use the term SOAR. He said there's two ways of doing SOAR, one of which is taking a technology and playbook and technology integration and automation approach. And the second one is taking a workflow approach. Like, one looks at you typically parts of an incident in end to end. So it looks at how do you detect, how do you triage, how do you investigate, or how do you respond? Whereas the workflow approach is much more holistic, right? So it's like if you detect an incident at lateral movement, that means all your preventative controls from exploitation, execution, infiltration into the organization have failed. So what you should be doing is every control that should have detected that thing coming into the organization, you should be able to pick that up and then tune those controls. So instead of this situation we end up in now, where analysts come to work in the morning and the screens are red, and then they come in the next morning and they're more red, and they leave in the evening and they're more red. And we get to a situation where we're actually solving the cause rather than just the symptom. And the cause is often bad content. It's often, things that we can automate that we don't automate, but we start at the wrong place. We start at automation rather than understanding what the process is and building a process that's repeatable and measurable. And again, that's a large part of my job at the moment. Is someone comes to us and says we want to buy a SOAR tool, and I go to them, well, what's the problem you're trying to solve with SOAR? And they're like, well, we want to automate everything. And then you start asking them questions about their maturity, and they have no standard processes. So what exactly are they automating? So you have to get them to that first level of maturity, and you can use a SOAR when you look at it, this wider perspective of how do I measure what I'm doing now? How do I identify the areas which are causing the greatest delay to my incident, my MTTR to respond to the incident? Where would have the most effect if I focus on automating that first? And how do I show the value to the business of working with me to automate that? CMDBs are always a problem, like knowing your assets. So how do I get their buy-in to work with me on this? And that's the evidence that using this minimum viable product in measuring things holistically end to end, you can start to build that comms plan I mentioned earlier and get that buy-in from working with IT to work on these things together. So it's those four things would be great. And if everyone could just go out and buy them and deploy them, but the reality is to deploy them well, we need to get buy-in from IT, we need to understand our assets, and we need to build the right processes for handling the triage and investigation of all of those incidents that will be created by those four technologies. And trying to deploy those four technologies without deploying those other things, it's a recipe for red screens every day.
If you think about MITRE, and looking at the sort of threats from an adversarial perspective that MITRE is well known for, and giving us that sort of taxonomy of tactics and techniques and tools that these adversaries are going to use, there is a big opportunity for organisations just based on the areas that you've focused on there. So whether that be process monitoring or file integrity monitoring, or you didn't say it with the scripts, but an example might be the ability to execute PowerShell, which is a massive vector that we see. So if you think about those, if you're locking down those four sort of control areas that you've talked about, then you're sort of operating at a higher level. You're not dealing with an IOC about WannaCry, if it got in via SMB1, we've been owned. Well, guess what? If it got in via SMB1, if we're whitelisting our processes, the process starts, it gets knocked out. file integrity is watching for mass file writes, mass file reads, mass file moves. Therefore, we're rising up to a sort of a tools, techniques, and procedure where we don't have to worry so much about the little IOCs on a daily threat intel perspective. We know from a resiliency standpoint that we're operating at a higher level, and we know that, yes, there might be a fundamental 0-day change, but a lot of what we're seeing is ransomware. A lot of what we're seeing is just 101 security stuff that can be cut off at the pass with the right focus in these areas. So if we move on to sort of best practice now, and you think about those sort of 4 control areas, I mean, that's great intel for an organization to explore those areas, but now this is where the rubber meets the road. Okay, so from a best practice standpoint, I know yourself, you've done a lot of work around the sort of taxonomy and the integration and the communication with the SOC, and then ultimately trying to orchestrate and automate. So just from a best practice standpoint, what advice can you give organizations? Okay, they've heard you. Yeah, let's get on top of file integrity monitoring. Let's get on top of scripts, how scripts can be run, under what privileges, and how controlled it is. We've got processes. We need to keep an eye on processes and so forth. So people have got that. How do they now take a practical approach to the next stage of moving towards some form of maturity and some form of business outcome-based success?
It's a great question. It's a very big question. So I think the other thing is yes, you can catch 86% of the MITRE attack techniques using those 4 methods, but are they the ones that the attackers are using against you? So don't discount those other 14, right? That 14% could be the ones that in your particular vertical market are being used, right? So don't just think 4 controls, game over. There are, and as I mentioned earlier, those 4 controls tend to be ones that are reasonably difficult to operationalize. And I'll go into that a little bit more detail now because it relates to best practice, right? So look at file integrity monitoring, right? So if you want to implement file integrity monitoring, people that have done it usually do it without context of what normal looks like, right? And that is because normal looks very different in a business. Right? And people haven't normally modeled what their business processes are, how that manifests itself in their IT infrastructures. And most people don't have time to do that kind of thing. So one of the things that you can look at, and I looked at, for instance, when I was previously in the CISO role, is you look at changes. Like, what is a valid change? What parts of the file system should be changed during that valid change, right? So you can start to look at the context of changes on your file systems against authorized changes by the CAB or that have gone through the change management system. And then you can start to identify either unauthorized changes made by individuals, which are a risk in themselves, or you can identify unauthorized changes that have been made by adversaries as a part of an attack. So both of which have different routes for escalation and different investigatory paths typically, but they both have the same impact. So one mitigates the impact of an attack because you can nip it in the bud when they're trying to deploy persistence techniques. The other one, you can potentially lower your attack surface because there's not going to be a configuration that you don't know about in your platform. So that's just one example, but that needs IT systems like change control to integrate into automated systems and enrichment of events when an analyst sees them. So an analyst needs to know about an asset, what's it doing, what changes have happened to it. So if you think about something easy like a daily shift handover report, that information about major changes in the business, new deployments of technology, related to projects there should be available to the analysts and discussed during shift handovers. But when they also open the event in their console, they should have that information instantly. Even better, that context, there should be an automated routing decision based on, and some kind of risk scoring decision based on whether that change is likely to be a malicious event or not. So that's the first best practice that I would say is, if you deploy this without thinking of the broader context of managing incidents, like the entire investigatory timeline, the enrichment, the contextualization of an event, as well as the playbooks and workflows and automations afterwards, then you are going to have a lot of red on your screen, right? So it's the same thing with script execution. What context was that script executed under? You know, which user did it? Which directory did it execute from? All of these things are important to understand. How do you model the scripts that different people within the organization use? And there's a lot of user and entity behavioral analytics tools to do that kind of thing. But you need to bring it back to a center, a decision engine that can take all of that information and contextualize it. And it's not a SIM, right? A SIM does a very important job, but most people don't do SIM well. And we both worked for SIM vendors in the past, so we know that. The problem is not the SIM. You know, customers go from QRadar to ArcSight to Logarithm to Splunk and say, oh, none of these SIMs work. Yeah, it's probably not the SIM. It's the way you build your content. It's the way you manage your upstream logging requirements and things like that. There's value in SIM, but there's a process to get SIM to work properly. And people, again, deploy the magic bullets, not the solutions. So I think that's my first best practice takeaway, is think about the bigger picture, right? Don't just deploy file integrity monitoring. Think about, how do you contextualize that? How do you eliminate false positives? And then how do I eliminate it in the first instance as a minimum viable product? And then how do I improve that over time? To build the continual improvement into it. So that was a very long answer, but these things aren't simple.
Well, you said it was a big question, so it required a big answer. So if we think about sort of experience now, and we've sort of touched on intelligence, we've touched on best practice, and now thinking back through the projects and customers and programs that you've been involved in, you touched on rationalisation, the current pandemic scenario. In fact, I built this studio. There's another chair to my left. I built this studio pre-COVID, but I actually only got round to releasing the channel just as COVID started to kick in. So I haven't had anyone in the studio yet. So I hope to get you in, James, and in person. And so if we think about this pandemic and the profound impact it's actually going to have, and it's having, on job loss and disgruntled employees and the geopolitical situation at the moment, it all just seems to be sort of amping up. And I'm not trying to put fuel on the fire here. I'm just trying to create a problem statement for the conversation. But there is, according to Gartner and others, there's a potential slowdown in the security spend as organisations have to do more with less and look for better outcomes than they've had, based on some of these challenges that you've talked about. So we are going to sort of move into a sort of you've mentioned about the rationalisation, the sort of optimization. So from a experience perspective, what can you share around that rationalisation in terms of how to identify perhaps controls and tools that aren't delivering the best value? Clearly, taking a threat-informed defence and using MITRE, and to your point, maybe the 4 control areas that you've mentioned, or the 4 security technology areas that you've outlined. You want to do your risk assessment, you want to do your threat analysis, and look at your industry and look at what the actors are doing in that industry, and MITRE is very, very good for that, clearly. So given the fact that we're getting a much clearer line of sight from MITRE, what would you sort of think back to from an experience standpoint that you can share to help organizations narrow in to get the most rapid return for their effort with the best sort of outcome as far as resiliency and security posture and cyber readiness and so forth?
Yeah, I think that the best approach, and no one's going to like this, right, is to get off the vendor hamster wheel and to go back to the basics, right? So start at the basics. The problem is the foundations on which we build a lot of cybersecurity programs, including some of the organizations I've worked for. We've had budgets of over $500 million a year, yet we don't do any cybersecurity risk assessments, which actually says, do we need the control over the assets that it's securing? So I think the important thing is to understand what you're protecting. Like, how do assets support the business? Now, if you can't go out and do a full modeling of a microservices architecture and how each asset is providing everything, start with your most critical business services. Start with the things that bring the money in and start describing them as 4 blobs rather than 80 servers, right? And then get more granular as time goes on. So going back to that basics of being able to understand what you're doing doesn't mean, and we have this perfectionist attitude in security, it's very binary, things are good or they're not. No, everything is great. And as long as you make them better than they were yesterday, you are improving the value you have to the business. So everyone waits for this perfect CMDB, and the perfect CMDB doesn't exist. So how do you get better context and more information about assets than you had yesterday? Rinse and repeat, right? And one of the best ways, and this is actually the advantage of where we're going, and you mentioned, the COVID situation, is the COVID situation has brought forward a lot of the digital transformation strategies, which were scheduled for 2 years, 4 years, 5 years, and may never have happened because other things would have come up. And this is actually eliminating a lot of the fragile artifacts that have existed within organizations and the artifacts of which they have no knowledge of, like the assets and artifacts that they just don't know what they're doing, and they have inherent vulnerabilities in them. And as they're moving to a cloud-first deployment strategy using orchestration tools, and I mean the wider term of orchestration, not security orchestration, but things like containers and Kubernetes, security have an opportunity to capture that information about what services are being provided and what assets they have at the point of instantiation, right? So we are in a better situation we've ever been in security, as long as we're sat with IT having this conversation. And one of the other things that I've noticed is, in the organization I've seen, is a severe lack of cloud awareness, containerization awareness, orchestration in the broader term awareness among IT security people, and their salaries are through the roof when they have this knowledge. But that is really, we have to step up. We can't put our arms around servers anymore. We have to step up. I mentioned earlier, no one likes change. We have to change and understand the way IT is going to be delivered in the future, rather than trying to be King Canute on the beach with our hands up, trying to stop the business doing it. Because otherwise people are going to work around us, and security will be provided by a third party rather than us if we keep getting in the way of the business. So I think, that's my answer to that, is this COVID situation has brought forward a lot of changes which have benefits for security. As long as we realize those benefits and we align with IT, I think there's going to be vulnerabilities because we're deploying in a hurry. We're deploying a lot of cloud broker technologies. We're deploying a lot of remote access. We're deploying things in a way which is not ideal. But hey, we've been in security long enough to know when the business has the luxury of a 2-year project plan, it still deploys things badly, right? So we're not in that much of a different situation. So I always like to see the benefits not the benefits, but the plus side in everything that's going on. And I think the security industry, if we take the right approach to working with the business and with IT, we can get some positives out of the changes that COVID will bring about. The redundancies, the changing in business models, that is something we can't do anything about, unfortunately. And it's, that's something that has a global impact among the, all over the world. And we just have to be agile to the consequences of that. And again, if we make our business rigid, and we are a rigid department that doesn't support the business, if it has to flip its business model on the head overnight, we're not supporting the business. So again, maintaining agility, minimum viable product, pragmatism, not big bang projects, not annual spending cycles. This is really where we need to be to really handle the uncertainty that we're in at the moment.
We're seeing at Attack IQ an actual sort of paradigm shift in the cybersecurity space. We're actually seeing this notion of sort of organizations looking at cybersecurity through the lens of a transformational step or a transformational program, and really sort of pausing on spending, as most businesses are. They're pausing on spending and they're taking stock, and they're going, okay, so let's really look at this from a sort of threat-informed defense, as we've sort of touched upon. Look at this in terms of who's most likely to come after us and how they're going to do it, and what's the likelihood, and what tools are they going to use, and what controls do we have to have in place, and how do those controls need to communicate, and how do we need to monitor them. And as you say, and then the orchestration, the automation starts to come into play. So we're seeing organizations really starting to think about that rationalization, sort of optimization, and I think this is something we're going to hear a lot more about going forward. And again, I just want to thank you for investing your time this evening and kindly doing this for the community. And just in terms of final word, just want to pass back to you, and if there's anything you wanted to add, anything that you're seeing at ServiceNow or in the industry that's exciting, or something that people should be watching out for as a final word, that would be fantastic. Thanks, James.
I mean, I think the thought I'll leave you with, and it relates to what you've just said about threat-informed defense. I love threat-informed defense, and I love zero trust networking, right? They are both brilliant concepts. But the problem for most organizations, and I mentioned maturity right at the beginning of the conversations, is it's too far ahead for them, right? But it isn't. And this is the thing. What they really do is they need to establish a roadmap of incremental improvements where they don't implement process and technical debt that will then create a ceiling later, right? So there's things you can do now where you think you're implementing threat-informed defense or zero trust networking, but what they'll later become is a weight around your neck that will prevent you maturing later. So the skill is getting that foundation right, focusing on what you, I think there's an organization that says, don't worry about what you can't change what you can change. And that's the same thing in cybersecurity. We need to get that focus on how do we take a step towards threat-informed defense, and then take the next step and the next step and the next step, not buy a threat-informed defense product, right? And this is what we need to do, is we need to get all our products working together in the way the organization works, with the teams the organization has, with their politics and their culture. And that takes vendors like ourselves and the customer working together and collaboratively, where they don't see us as an adversary, they see us as someone who's there to help them. And from a ServiceNow perspective, we are a software as a service business, right? So if we sell something and the customer doesn't get value out of it, or they don't utilize it, or we don't help them operationalize it, we don't get our license, our subscription revenue in the next year. So it's vitally important for us, for the customer to be successful. And I think that's a model vendors need to take going forward. I'd like to see more people like myself in vendors, and I know a lot of them have them. And I think Attack IQ has a similar role, where we're there as an advocate for the customer. We understand what they're trying to do, and we make sure everyone is kept honest, and we make sure that we're actually delivering the value and supporting the customer, because the skills needed for transformation are very different than the skills needed to run BAU once it's implemented. So that's a very long parting thought, but that's what I'd sort of I'd like to leave everyone with.
Thanks, James. And yes, you're right. At Attack IQ, we've got a lot of practitioners, ex-practitioners, ex the defence community and forces, and ex-chief information security officers, a number within the business to really bring that sort of customer voice to bear. And I think in conclusion, from my perspective, to customers, it's really quite simple. We've got tons of assets. Let's start sweating them. Okay, so as James has said, it's not about buying new tools or new shiny widgets. It's really about focusing in on what we have and getting it working properly and getting it working in a cohesive way, and making sure that it's operationalized, and we're on that journey to maturity, based on use cases that are going to drive demonstrable business outcomes. So I just really want to thank James for his time, and thank the audience. And you know the rules. If you like this and you thought it was valuable, please share, like, subscribe to the channel, because that drives more sort of mind share within the community. And then if you want to get notified of these videos as they come available, just click on the bell and you will be notified as such. So thank you, James, and that's it from me, and we'll see you on the next time. I'm actually hoping to interview some of the ex-chief information security officers at Attack IQ. That'll be a nice place to go next, so watch out for that. And as I said, James, thank you very much, and thanks for putting your time in this evening, and now you can get onto your email and carry on into the night.
No problem. Thank you very much.